Michigan, that's right, we're talking Detroit. Yes. I'm sorry, Florida. See, Florida, we got quite a bit of Florida. Maybe we have to do a CooperCon Florida thing at some point. So, any other states? Yes, sir. Wisconsin, okay. Virginia, beautiful Virginia. Love Virginia. I'm a native of Washington, D.C., so I love that Virginia very much. So, and Mark, California, that's right. And I'm from Arizona. Thomas from Arizona. I've actually got 1 foot in Arizona, 1 foot out the door, going to parts unknown. But anybody else that we didn't mention here, states-wise or whatever? Oregon. Oregon, well, yeah. We got Oregon and Washington, yes. But you don't know Tina Buckland. Okay, fair enough. So, Idaho, okay, there we go, Idaho. And yeah, that's right, Idaho as well for Karen back there. So, all right, wonderful. Well, so today we've got a really exciting CooperCon worked out for us. First off, we're going to start with Tom Kaye, who we all love. He's going to be talking about the money that was found on Tina Bar, and what that tells us as far as that goes. After that, it's going to be a lot of fun, some fireworks with Chris Cunningham and me. We're gonna debate the thing that everybody loves to talk about, and that's the flight path.
Oh man!
I'm the only guy apparently in the world that thinks something ain't right, but
I have to take an early
so
lunch.
I'm gonna kind of just I'm gonna go ahead and argue my case, and Chris, of course, is gonna argue for the veracity of the FBI flight path. So it'll be, I think, the against the world, I think, is kind of the feeling I'm getting with respect to that. Then, of course, we've got another panel a little bit later on that relates to D.B. Cooper and pop culture. Jude's going to be up here with us. He's an author, very successful author, just published a book related to D.B. Cooper. We'll have a handful of us up on stage as well that have been in various shows on TV related to Cooper. We'll just talk about sort of the whole phenomenon of D.B. Cooper, the pop culture aspect. CooperCon itself, I think, is part of that as well. And then at the end of the day, we've got a very special treat. Our good friend Martin McNally, front row here, is going to be speaking with Ryan Burns for a couple of hours about his experience in 1972, skyjacking an American Airlines jet, I believe is what it was. Jumping out, surviving, getting caught, of course, but he's going to talk to us about his experiences, because this man actually did this exact same thing. So having said that, thank you again for joining us today, and let's go ahead and hand the mic over to Tom and hear what Tom has to say. Thank you.
Hello everyone, give me a second here while I fire up. And today we're going to be talking about the money, which everybody loves. And if you notice the title, Forensic Bandology, which is a great title, I think. Thank you, ChatGPT. We're going to be talking about the rubber bands on the money, which is quite an enigmatic subject here. So, here's basically the debatable facts about the rubber bands on the money found on Tina Bar. When Brian found the money, one of the descriptions in the 302 was that he said that when he pulled the bundles out of the sand, there was rubber bands on the bundles, but the rubber bands had deteriorated, and when he touched them, they crumbled away. Now, you guys have been doing some historical research lately to say where were the rubber bands on the bundles. This turns out to be the whole point of this talk, because if it had paper straps around the center, it would have rubber bands around the edges, which is what the debate is. So the banks typically would take 100 bills of whatever, and they would put a paper strap around those 100 bills, and that appears to be the typical thing. We have Mr. Grinnell here today, who is from the bank, and his wife also worked at the bank, and he's hopefully going to give us some information on this. So we all kind of agree that the paper straps would not last very long in water. So we have zero evidence of the paper straps, but that does not seem to be too unusual. So one of the questions that we'd all like answered is whether or not the money that was found on Tina Bar had a human involvement in the burial. There's theories that go both ways. If the rubber bands on the bundles prove to be in a different location than what would typically come from a bank, then that would mean humans were involved before Tina Bar money got buried. So you can see why this is an interesting conundrum to try and work out. The problem is there is zero evidence of rubber bands today on any of the money. You'd think there'd be a stripe or something on the money. We've not seen a single shred of evidence as to where the rubber bands were on the money. So I'm going to attempt today to infer where these rubber bands were and kind of put this to rest. So for you that have been following, this is old news, but for the new people here, there was a debate originally. They thought that money would float and roll down all the rivers and end up on Tina Bar. If you actually put a bundle of money in the water, we find out that it fans out like this and then sinks after about 5 or 10 minutes. Now, in this fanning out, you can get diatoms in these areas here, right? And that's what we've seen in the other studies that I've done, that the diatoms are on the bills, which means the bills got in the water, the bills fanned out, and then they closed up and were buried in the sand, and that's where the diatoms are. So the first option is Exhibit A here, where the rubber bands were in the middle. And this is actually the idea that I favor. If it's banded in the middle, that means somebody would have probably rebanded them. Exhibit B, the other side of the coin, is there was a paper strap in the middle, and then there was a rubber band on each side. So we're going to try and determine whether or not either of these is true. So, who thinks, raise your hands, there was a band in the center? Okay, about half the population. Who thinks there was two bands on either end? Less people. Okay, and a couple of I have no idea.
I'm not voting yet. Yeah, I'm not with you.
All right, so that's good. I'm glad that there's a split on this, right? There's a split. So we have to come up with enough evidence to convince you. So my next question is, how many lines of evidence do I have to show you in order to convince you one way or another? All right, does it take one? About 2, 3 lines of evidence? We're not going to 4 because I don't have 4. Okay.
I'm good with 3.
I got Nikki here saying, I'll go with 3 lines of evidence and I'm convinced. You guys are making it tough on me. You guys are making it tough. So I'm going to try and show you multiple intersecting lines of evidence, which in the scientific world would be pretty damn good proof, right? It's not just a one angle we're going to look at and say, well, this must mean it's true. We're going to look at a couple of different angles. So that comes the question, without any evidence at all, how are we going to figure this out, right? How are we going to work on this whole thing? Well, take a guess. Any ideas, anybody? Shout it out.
Show me the money. Astronella.
Okay, you know I've been working with the diatoms before, so we're going to work with them again. Diatoms is not something you would normally think would produce a location for rubber bands. But in this case, we're going to attempt to use the diatoms to, once again, pull something out of thin air here and come up with a fact about the Cooper case, of which there are very few to go around. Diatoms. How are we going to do it with diatoms? We're going to use a transect. Might be a new word for some of you. It's a very scientific thing. What is a transect? A transect is a linear path or line used for systematic data collection. So what you do is you go through and you take samples along a line. In this case, this is an archaeological dig. That's a scale ruler there in the middle. And they had found pottery shards in this dig. So while they were digging it out, lots of pottery shards showed up. So they knew humans lived there, but finding their shards in the ground didn't tell them much about it. Was it a single occupation? Did it last a long time? Were there multiple occupations? So in order to sort that information out, what they did was they sampled vertically along the wall. These are individual samples, they're strung together. And as they sampled them, they counted the number of pottery fragments in each sample. Then they plotted the pottery fragments on a vertical line. So you can see that there were two indications of habitability in this area. Two separate groups inhabited this area at two different times. That's not something you could tell just by looking at a pile of pottery shards in a bunch of dirt. So they sampled along a line, and then they added up the number of samples they found at each point. They produced this graph. Does that make sense? Because this is the whole crux of the whole thing. So, what I did on the bill, Mark Metzler's bill, which if we didn't have, we wouldn't have any of this information. Mark came up to me many years ago and said, I'm hoping my bill can talk. And I think at this point his bill has screamed. Here's the bill. What I did was, I did a transect across the bill. What does that mean? I put the bill in my electron microscope, and then at high magnification, I scanned down the center of the bill, looking for diatoms. And every time I found a diatom, I could measure its position along that line, and I recorded it. So this is a very tedious process. You're looking at about 2,000 magnification. So you're looking at an area about the size of 3 or 4 or 5 blood cells wide, which takes you a long time to look at that across the length of a bill like this. It's not something you can normally do. It's not something I could have done with my previous electron microscope. This has only been possible with this new one that I've just had for a couple of years now. It allows me to put the entire bill into the chamber. Normally, as you saw yesterday, those little stubs go in the chamber. This time we could put the whole bill in the chamber. So as I'm going along, I take pictures. You can see along the top. These are pictures of the diatoms that I found. And then I go through and I add up at every location how many diatoms did I see. And that gives us this chart. See this? So this means, this is coordinated with the length of the bill. In this zone right here, right about right there were 6 diatoms right there. But over here, at the edge, in this zone here, there were no diatoms. If we go to the other side of the coin, you can see in this zone here, no diatoms, but over here, more diatoms. Let that sink in for a minute.
Ooh.
So where are the majority of the diatoms? Center of the bill. Now, had I put a rubber band around the middle of this bundle of bills, you saw from the previous image that they're squished together by the rubber band. When the bills are squished together, can the diatoms get in? No. It can only get in when the money fans out. So what this data indicates is that no diatoms were getting in on the ends, lots of diatoms were getting in the middle. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Are we following along here?
So, looks like
So then you say, okay, can we look at it a different way? Well, as I've made this model specifically for this talk here, this is the diatom that we've been talking about on the money for several years now. This is Astrianella. Now, as you can see, this is a big spindly thing. Diatoms are made of glass. So how fragile do you think this is if it's made of glass? It would break very easily. So this diatom normally floats in the water because if it got into the sand, it would be busted apart by the sand. But this is a big diatom. A normal diatom would be about the size of my fingernail, maybe my thumbnail. So this is a big boy. So we say, okay, the biggest diatoms, right? The ones that would need the widest separation of the bills in order to get in there, where are those on the bill? So looking at just those diatoms, we come up with this graph. So this shows us that the Astrianella diatoms are again easily found in the middle, not found on the ends. So if we go to the biggest diatoms, that can tell us where the widest separation of the bills were. And it looks like, again, lots of diatoms, large ones, in the middle. If we look at the disc diatoms, which are the most common ones, sorts these guys out. These are smaller. They're like an Oreo cookie. And they can kind of slide into things. So you see a lot more of them. But again, we hold up with this idea that in this zone here and in the end zone, no diatoms. And these can wedge in much tighter than the Astrianella ones. So what we're showing is wide separation in the middle of the bills, almost no separation on the ends. So now if we go back to our two choices, Exhibit A, center banded, squished together, versus B, side banded, squishing on the sides, what do you think is the outcome of our research here? Anybody voting for A? Anybody voting for B? All right, we almost have a damn unanimous decision here. Nobody voted for A. So you can see what we did here to determine where the rubber bands were. Unbelievable that the diatoms is telling us all this, right? It's kind of crazy. So as a side, one of the things you can do when you do a transect, they like to do this in Africa. They say, well, how many dead animals are out on the plains of Africa? They'll do a transect where they'll walk 5 miles across the open plain in Africa and they'll count all the skeletons. So when you walk for 5 miles and you can see about 20, 30 feet in either direction, you can say, well, there's 10 skeletons in this 5-mile zone. That means if we add up the area of the whole thing, we can calculate how many dead animals there are in the whole savanna. So what we can do here, we can say how many Astrianella are on the bill. One of the criticisms that I've had is that I've said that the Astrianella diatoms are found in the springtime because that's when they bloom. Other people have said, well, you could find some of them in the wintertime, which is true. The number of Astrianella diatoms in November is not 0. There's a few in the water. So if we ask the question, how many Astrianella diatoms are on the bill, that should give us a good idea of whether it was a few in the water or not. Well, based on the transect numbers, there are over 2,000 Astrianella diatoms on one side of the bill, even when you clamp off the ends and don't have any accumulate. So how many diatoms had to be in the water to get 2,000 on one side of the bill? There's probably 4,000 on both sides. That's just a ton of diatoms to have to end up on a little piece of paper this big. Just a ton. So keep that in mind. One end's pitched off. It's still got a lot of them. So I think that kind of reinforces my original idea. So that's the first line of evidence. Let's go to a second line of evidence. This one was provided by our good friend Brian Ingram, who still has a few Cooper Cooper bills left in his collection. But he told me one time that he also has a lot of fragments. So I asked him, I said, Brian, can you give me a few fragments that I can have in my lab to look at? And he brought me some fragments that were very small. You can see it right here. But the cool thing about this fragment that he brought is that there's 4 layers of bills in this fragment. So these are absolutely virgin. Absolutely virgin. Everything else may have been through, cleaning from the Ingrams or the separation at the place that did the professional evaluation of the bills. So I was able to separate these, and let me tell you, it was not easy. These things are like potato chips. Yep. As I started separating these, they started flaking into pieces. It's amazing we actually have full-size bills to work with in our Cooper vortex here, because I would have a hell of a time separating a package of these things. Those guys really knew what they were doing. So I took these pieces and I put them on a stub, and I started zooming in. And what I found was they were unbelievably clean. I could not find anything in between the bills from this fragment sample. So this is fairly low power. This is 72 power magnification. To you, it looks like there may be some stuff here, but most of this is the texture of the money, normal texture. If we zoom in, this is 800 power. Again, it looks like there's things here, but this is all money texture. You see no individual grains of anything on here. If we go into magnification about 3,500, again, this is all money, tissue, you know, what you'd expect to find normally on this stuff. There's no individual things that got in there, no diatoms, no nothing. So, being this clean kind of says that this money was never exposed to the water in the way you think. So, we can infer that this was from a zone that was clamped by the rubber bands. So the question remains, where did it come from on the bills? Where do you think? It came from the corner. So this is the second line of evidence that shows this zone on the bills was clamped tight and did not allow things in there. So the second line of evidence shows that the band would have been toward the edge of the bill, not toward the center. You with me?
Yeah.
Okay. So, looking back on this, no diatoms. Frags came from a low diatom count area as predicted by the previous investigation with the line, the transect line. So the second line of evidence here supports the first line of evidence that the rubber bands were at the edges of the bills. So let's look at a third independent line of evidence. One of the bills that we got from the FBI back in 2008 had a corner that still had a stack of bills on it. That this is again undisturbed. These got ripped apart when they separated the money. You can see from the text on here, we can determine the alignment of the bills. So this is on our Citizen Sleuth site from way back when, where we aligned all the bills to see how the bills were sitting in the sand. Well, fortuitously, if we look at this from a different idea, from a different angle, we can say, well, if there was a rubber band around these bills, where would that rubber band be? Turns out it would be right here. Hold everything together. So again, is that in the middle of the bills? No. It's on the edge of the bills. So this shows us that the angle of the bills were like this in natural position in the sand. It shows an overlap on the left end, and a rubber band in that position would create the pattern that we see. So this is a third line of evidence that supports the first and the second line of evidence. So, I was going to ask you whether or not I've changed your mind. I think I have, but this is one of the original ideas that I thought was the case. If you had asked me a while back, do I think there's rubber bands in there, I'd say, well, there's rubber bands in the middle, because that's typically how I remember them. But what we're seeing now is this is actually more likely as to what happened. Rubber bands, and this is kind of cobbled together picture, rubber bands were on the ends, and the center opened up and let the diatoms in, and the very edges could also open up and let the diatoms in. So, if we speculate for a minute, it's not likely that a person would use two rubber bands to bundle these things together. It does seem very likely that you would use two rubber bands, one on each end, for a bank stack, which the research has been telling us was the most likely scenario to come out of Sea First Bank. One of the problems is we can account for 3 bundles on Tina Bar, but we seem to think, and maybe we'll get some clarification on this later, that their banks may have put 5 of these bundles together with rubber bands. So that's maybe still an open question. But what we can tell from this research at this point is that it almost surely points to rubber bands on each end of the bundle. Probably the reason why all 3 bundles ended up together on Tina Bar is because they were all rubber banded together, not individually rubber banded. So this leads us to ask the question, well, okay, what theories go, what theories stay? So I leave that all up to you. So again, diatoms have turned out to be way more informative than we would have ever thought. Pattern of diatoms on the bills favors 2 rubber bands pretty clearly. I think from your hand raising, we've all kind of been convinced here. Brian's frags show no diatoms in the correct zone. Angled bills also suggest a on-edge rubber band situation. with that, I'd like to say special thanks to TSS Microscopy and Larry Carr for putting up with us for all these years. I wish he was here. And willing to take some questions. And one more time before we finish, I want to reinstate again for those that were here. We had some trouble with the Washington State History Museum. They will not allow us to sticky sample the chute that's there, and it's kind of off limits on a personal basis. So we're asking that you do not donate any Cooper memorabilia to the Washington State Museum. It would just be like throwing it away. And we'd all like to be able to research in the future and solve this case. After we solve it, they can do whatever they want. Thank you very much.
So I think we all want to thank Tom for finally doing a presentation that gives us answers and not more confusion. So let's give him another round of applause. I'm sure there are questions. Let's raise some hands and let's start over on this side. Eric.
Two things. How do you reconcile the fact that Brian, the kid who found the money, actually says he recalls the rubber bands, the fragments being fused to the presidential portrait, so the center of the bill? So if that's credible, that seems like very difficult to refute. The other thing is the sample size. I know that you're dealing with single digits, 2 diatoms here, 6 I think at one point near the center, a couple. Do you feel that the sample size is weighty enough to be significant?
Yeah, because if you draw a line across the tops of the peaks, which is what you typically do, you would average the number across. That average would have a hump in the middle. If I expanded the width that I was looking at, if I went back and forth several times, you could double, triple, or quadruple that number. Instead of 6, it could be 24 in the middle. But all the others should multiply the same, and you'd still have a hump. It would just be smoother. Does that make sense? I never heard that Brian found them across the
Yeah, that was one of the questions I'd asked. In fact, it's on the Facebook Live interview I did with him. He says that he recalls them asking, this was part of the discussion. I said, where on the bill were they? And he said that they were he recalls the fragments being over the president's portrait in the center.
I recently had a conversation. He told me the same thing.
There's a conflict there. There would definitely be a conflict. Because this data indicates that we're not in the middle.
You can't hear what Eric.
No, all I'm saying here, I don't want to take up any time here.
No, the only reason I've been a very strong advocate for the rubber bands being in the center is because Brian Ingram, the then boy who found the money, I asked him, where were the rubber bands? Because there were rubber band fragments fused to the bills. Where on the bill were they? And he said, over the presidential portrait. He said that it was in the center of the bill. Maybe he's remembering wrong, but for what it's worth, that's what Brian Ingram actually says.
I'm just curious, you talked about with the center rubber band that the money would, when you put it in water, would fan out and eventually sink in the center. Do you have any idea what the flotation characteristics, if it's banded on both sides, if it's any different?
I have to imagine, because we know it opened up enough to get the biggest diatoms in there, that it would be the same characteristic. It would probably take longer. You'll sink a one rubber band deal in about 5-10 minutes. It may take 20 or 30 minutes to sink a double banded bundle, but I would bet that it's going to sink.
I can actually answer that question. I actually did an experiment at home in my bathtub. I got a bundle of 300 ones with currency straps on them and rubber bands on either end, exactly as it was demonstrated in Tom's presentation here. And I set it on top of my bathtub water, and it sank in about 4 or 5 minutes. the bubbles came out, as Tom explained, from kind of the between the rubber bands, bubbled out, water got inside, and it sank to the bottom in about 4 or 5 minutes. So a double rubber banded bundle floats for about 4 or 5 minutes, at least according to the experiment that I conducted, because I'm a weirdo. Questions?
Okay, so what did the bank
that's what we hope we're gonna find out from Mr. Grinnell today.
Yes, in fact, that would, a great segue, thank you. I couldn't have planned that any better. We have a guest here in the audience, a gentleman by the name of Mr. William Grinnell. Mr. Grinnell was working, he was a young man, working in the bank at that time, and he was tasked with delivering the money from Sea First Bank to the airport so that that money could then be provided to D.B. Cooper. So he was one of the last people to have possession of that bank bag before it was delivered to the plane. He worked in the banking industry for decades in bank security, and in fact his family lineage, and Bill, correct me if I'm wrong, your grandfather and father were also in the banking industry. So, and his lovely wife Peggy also worked at Sea First National for many decades. So definitely a knowledge of the banking industry. So, and I've spoken with Bill at length a couple times, but I'm going to turn the mic over to Bill, and maybe he can add a little insight into how, number one, how banks usually packaged money, and then perhaps how he recalls the money itself that night. Bill?
I'm gonna sit because I'm a little
That's perfectly fine.
unsteady. First off, I've had this knowledge obviously since the day it happened. I had no idea that it would end up being such a huge issue. So many crimes that we have been. Keep the microphone closed. Oh, sorry. So many of these kinds of things, they happen. You don't think much about it at the time, and now 50 years later, you're sitting here trying to remember details that didn't seem to mean anything at the time. To begin with, it's Thanksgiving Eve. 4 of us are sitting around our office waiting for the boss to say, let's go ahead and cut out early, it's Thanksgiving, hoping that, we'll be soon. The bank's closed about an hour before. We usually would wait until they've been closed for an hour before we went home. Probably 15, 20 minutes before we're figuring we're out of here, I see the boss pick up his phone, and that look is like, uh-oh. And we're assuming we just had a robbery and we're all going to be up for hours trying to deal with it. He says, he came to me and he said, get over to the police department. They're packaging, or we're going to move the money to the airport. Well, many questions are going through my mind. What money? Where's this coming from? What's the demand? But I'm the young guy, so I'm just, yes, sir, we'll do whatever needs to be done. It took off in a way that no one could ever plan for. I'm sure people have developed plans now, but nobody's expecting it to happen quite that way. While I'm going to our vault, which is in another building about 2 blocks away, to supervise the movement of that money, one of the other partners that I had and worked with is meeting with the police department to try to coordinate getting the money out to the airport. Cooper had said he didn't want any police involvement, so it has to be done in a secret. Trying to take that kind of money out on the street, that was probably the safest way to do it, was just to not tell anybody what we're doing and just jump in and do it. And by the time anybody thinks about it, it's over. So we got a plainclothes police unit to take us in their car out to the airport. Remember, this is Thanksgiving Eve. I-5 is a huge corridor for traffic. So we're driving down the freeway, off the road more than on the road, to try to get in and out of all these cars, with cars parking or honking at us because they don't know that we're not just a bunch of weirdos trying to jump the line. I'm scared to death because I have this bag sitting in my lap with money in it. And I'm visualizing this falling apart, and you guys are all going 20 years from now, so did they use rubber bands on both ends? So I apologize, I was really interested in listening to your, examination on it, but I'm thinking, so many people touch that money who never, they were taught in teller training, here's how we bundle our money. They're doing it every day. They're, yes, they're pretty close to following a procedure, but there's a lot of people that are gonna be, it's time for me to go home. If I don't get it just perfect, nobody's ever gonna know because my name's not on it. But I'm finding that fascinating to think that you've dealt that deep. So, back to what we're doing. We get out to the airport. The police are still helping us or watching us. And we go to the closest branch, which we called our CTAC branch, and we pick up the manager of that branch, so we have somebody who, is with the bank that can do all the things that might be necessary. He's just as confused as we are. He was just told by the people downtown, you need to get out there and you're our banker on site. We then drive to, I don't know what the formal name was, but it was where
I believe it was Northwest Airlines,
Operations shack, which was down underneath the level of which you typically see at the airport. We get there and we're talking about, okay, what are we doing? How are we going to do this? And eventually the police, the FBI is saying, okay, here's what his demand is. He doesn't want anybody other than 3 people to be present, and that was the pilot and 2 stewardesses. While this is going on, there's a lot of confusion as to, how are we going to get it out there if he doesn't want anybody to go? Just different things are popping up. Eventually, the 3 employees from the airport or from the plane come to the plane. A couple of them take possession of the bag, start to go out towards the plane, and our branch manager says, shouldn't we get a receipt for this? Good idea. So I turn around and we grab a receipt book and we write up a, IOU or funds provided, and I hand it to
Ali, I believe it was, right?
Yes, it was her. And she heads out to the plane. Now, typically at this point in the situations that I had been into to date, and there weren't many, we would all just kind of wait for the police to step in and take the bad guy down, and we'd deal with it right there. The closer he got to the airplane, the more that question was in everybody's mind. And we had a lot of people that were jumping on board because they were needed by one group or another to be eyes on. Nobody pulls the plug and says, stop, we're not going any further. We all stand there and watch the plane take off. And we're all looking at each other, who can we blame for this? And it flew off. So the airport provides everybody that was involved, because there's police, FBI, airport authorities, and just about anybody who would have a reason to be there was there. We were given a room near the, one of the offices, and there were probably 50 people in it. And they piped in the information that was coming over the radio from the plane as to, you know, where he was going, what he was doing. And as it went on, you know, the farther away the plane got, the more we all started going, what are we gonna tell the people above us that are gonna wanna know why this happened? We stuck around a long time that evening trying to come up with what could we have done, because we knew that would be the answer. We had no idea that this wouldn't still end soon. I know that jet airplanes were sent from Whidbey Island, but it was so rainy and muddy, they were having a hard time keeping the plane at a level that they could operate in, because, you know, they go a lot faster, they kept overflying, and they'd have to go quite a ways out. The last thing we heard was it was somewhere still in Washington, but they had lost touch with where it was. So it's been interesting to me over the years to hear about so many of you who have taken such an interest in it and come up with ideas that maybe I knew, no, it didn't work that way, but I was keeping my mouth shut because people a lot smarter than I were working on it forever. I have what I think is the TV ending of the whole thing. And it's a picture, or it's 4 guys, woodsman type guys, sitting at a table with a beer in their hands saying, "Coop, I never thought you could pull that off." And they had all put up money, tearing up the money that was stolen, but replacing it with new money and giving it to him for having pulled off magic. I'm really interested in watching and listening. I kept it quiet for 50 years and finally decided people needed to hear a little bit more about some of the weird things that were going on in the background that probably never got out. Any questions?
A couple of things, Bill. I'm going to put you on the spot, and his lovely wife Peggy too. In regards to the money, how, Bill, do you recall seeing seeing the money and how it was packaged together? Was it similar to something that you saw up here, or was it different?
No, it was very similar to what you've seen. Now, but remember, this money was put together by numerous different people. So one person might, you know, have it this high in a batch. Teller right next to it might have been in a hurry and had it this high in a batch. So it's kind of hard to say this is the way it's got to be, or always is, because different people were preparing those packages.
And Peggy, you worked with money for a long time too. Do you recall that as the standard operating procedure for how money was bundled?
So standard operating was you put the paper scrap around the center, and as Bill said, each person might tighten it more or less. And in those days, it was used Scotch tape to adhere the ends of the strap. And then as you bundled, and I remember it as bundling 5 bundles of strap money with rubber bands at the end of them.
Right. So, but as Bill said, it was a confusing day, a scramble, multiple people working on it. People may have just kind of haphazardly done it the best that they could. So,
Bill, when did you know it was a hijacking?
The FBI called my boss, who was a former FBI agent in charge, saying we need some help from you. And we're the biggest bank in the area.
He said, there's a skyjacking going on. He told them at that time?
Yeah.
And ironically, in discussions, NWA had an account, a corporate account at Sea First National Bank.
Our understanding, Bill, is that the bank had a $250,000 special stash of money set aside for these types of purposes with the bill numbers already recorded. Do you recall that being the case, and was that money prepared any differently than what we would normally find in a teller's drawer?
As I remember, it was prepackaged just like any other bundle of cash, put in a separate safe that we had, so certain members of the bank could gain access to it. So they just went in and grabbed it, and prior to the day that was done, we had taken that money and filmed it. So that's where we were coming up. We were able to, within 3 days, just about every bank in the state had a packet about that big of all the bills that have been taken. And you know, those were collector items for a long time, and then everybody threw them out because it was obvious the money wasn't showing up.
So one question, we talked about this too, Bill, is when you were in the back of that car driving to the airport and you had that bank bag sitting in your lap, how do you recall the money feeling in your lap? Do you recall loose bills, or do you recall big chunks or bricks of money?
Well, the money was pre-packaged, as all cash is. My wife could speak more to that, but we had it in a separate safe that certain members of the bank had access to. So if there was an emergency, they could go in and remove what was needed. I don't remember there being anything particular about it because we didn't want it. You know, we wanted it to be as common as it should be.
So you don't recall anything necessarily about the money in the bag, how it felt in your lap, or when you carried it, if it was more brick-like, or if it was more loose money?
The way money was packaged in those days, and I think it's probably pretty much the same today, you had different people that would pack it up. There was a standard, but you had, 100 different people doing that standard.
Do we, question mark?
Yeah, thank you for, both of you, for coming here today. It's very interesting to hear your direct observations on the night of the hijacking. I have a question about these prepackaged, ransom bags or something, that had all the numbers recorded. Banks don't like to have idle money. You can't loan that money out. Who paid for that?
There was a lot of conversation about that. You got to also remember, though, banks, we had millions of dollars in our bank going around, and to take $1 million and set it in the vault, knowing that if we had to use it, we could certainly get it, but we've got, in those days, we had $60–70 million in the vault
Okay.
at any given time.
So the government did not subsidize that?
I haven't run across any place where the government subsidized anything for a long time. It may seem like it, but
Can I have the mic?
Sure.
And the reason I ask these questions, if I were planning a hijack like this, I would never assume that you could get the money, especially late in the day. Is it possible, and I'd like your opinion on this, did Cooper know, did people outside banking know about these stashes of prepackaged, ransom bags and so forth?
I would doubt it, because Sea First Bank in those days was the biggest bank in the West, or Northwest at least. we were the only bank that provided that particular service, and there were very few people who knew anything about it in the bank even. Senior management, only a couple people could say, yes, go ahead and activate that particular service.
Did law enforcement know that these prepackaged recorded bundles existed?
Maybe, I can't say for sure. It wasn't something that we advertised, because we didn't want to be in that business.
Of course.
Did they use die packs back then? Did they use die packs back then in the banking industry?
I don't believe we were using them yet. I mean, we were the first bank in the Northwest to start using die packs. But I don't remember that. I think maybe we did know about die packs, but it was a situation where we didn't want to be doing anything that, since we didn't know how much Cooper knew about what was going on, and he seemed to have a plan. We wanted it to look just like it would normally be if somebody was robbing a bank.
So we have a couple minutes, so I want to have some questions for Tom, if you have questions for Tom, or questions for Bill Grinnell.
Hi, Bill. Thank you for coming along today, to you and Peggy. And I suppose it could be for both of you, but in your opinion, could $194,000 of hot money be spent without ever turning up or coming to the attention of the authorities in any way whatsoever?
So the question was, do you believe that the 194,000, the 200,000, could it be spent in 1971 and then not be discovered somewhere in circulation?
I think because we got the bills, or the list of all the bills out to the banks within like 2 days, in the Northwest at least, every teller in the state wanted to be the one who found one of those, so there's a lot of focus on it. A month later, people weren't paying any attention. I think they would have shown up if they were used, or, if somebody was right away trying to throw them around. But I think my belief is that he was smart enough to know I can't walk out the door and start flashing money, because everybody's going to figure out what I'm doing.
And Peggy, you'd agree with that assessment as a former teller?
I would, because the number of bills that pass through a teller's hand in a day, in those days especially, looking at each bill against a list of serial numbers isn't really rational to think that it's possible to look at every bill.
Any questions for Tom or Bill? Over here, I've been spending most of my time on that side. Let me get over here. Bruce? The mayor is about to speak.
I have a question for Bill. Bill, I'm the journalist who left my business card in your front door about 10 years ago. So hello. Welcome to the conference. I'd like to clarify how the money got transferred. So you are holding on to the money bag in the back of a car. What happens at SeaTac? Who did you give it to? Where'd that money go? Do you know how it got on the plane?
Hold on, I'm coming with Mike. Starting my exercise regimen early.
The money, we took the money to the airport. We took it down in their operations area. We transferred the money there into the hands of the representative from the airline, who then signed for it. Actually, we started letting it go without signing anything, and it was brought to my attention that we probably should get a receipt. So we brought it back in. They signed for it, handed it to them. They walked out the door onto the plane.
Thank you. Thanks, Bruce. Behind you, Chris. Behind you.
Do you recall how much material of the bank bag, there was above the level of the money? Like, was there a lot of give above the money as you carried it?
I was carrying what we call the currency bag, they go like
Yeah,
that.
like this, that's it, right?
That's, yeah, that's a good example of typically how we moved money.
I think he was asking, is there room at the top to tie it and close it? So
Oh, yeah, yeah. There, we have,
Crimped shut? Was it crimped shut?
yes, it was crimped shut, as I remember. So it's got like a metal clip that goes on the top. You put the money in here, you put the clip on it, and that,
You tighten the strings on it, and then you cramp the lid.
and how much typically was going in?
Well, and it,
Well, yeah,
what was it, 200,000, and
yeah.
was it
20s.
smoked in 20s? You'd have quite a bit left at the top of the bag. If you think of the Santa Claus bag,
we
you
have to
have
have
it.
Actually, I think Josh had yeah, here. Bill, you can hold on to this mic, that way I don't pass out. I have a question that ties back to what Tom was showing in terms of the bills, in terms of the band in the middle around the sides. Ms. Brunel, you had said, I think, and I want to make sure I heard it right, that your standard operating procedure was to have a paper band around the center, and you meant to say with Scotch tape perhaps. And then you said that you bundled 5 bundles of strap money together. So I guess the strap money is what we call it. You said, I think, rubber bands on both sides. So to me, that implies, if I'm understanding correctly, and Tom, maybe I'll ask for your thoughts too, not just the middle, not just the sides, but potentially both. Now, not necessarily every bill that was found would have that, but would you say that most bills would have had 3 areas on the bill that had some kind of squeezing from a strap or a rubber band?
Yes. Standard practice would have been that. Whether they had the paper straps on those bills, don't know, but standard, you put a strap on, a paper strap which said how much money was in it, so $1 bills had a specific strap, $5 bills had a specific strap, $20 bills had a specific strap. So that paper strap would be in the center of the 100 bills, and then rubber bands at the end if you had 5 straps.
Yeah, I also want to add that the paper straps would dissolve away in the water right away. And also it says that if the money was put in fresh into the sand, the paper strap should still be on it.
We'll do one more question. All right, we'll have our last question here.
Mr. and Mrs. Grinnell, thank you so much for coming today. This has really made us think back here, because it's really always bothered me that all that money was sitting waiting. And as Mark pointed out, banks don't make money by leaving it in their vault. Cooper said famously that that this particular flight did his time and place or whatever. Since you're talking about having that kind of money sitting around in your bank and being the largest bank in the Pacific Northwest, could it be that Cooper knew, not necessarily that you had any ransom stash or anything, but I'm just kind of wondering if Cooper knew that he wanted to fly to the place in the Pacific Northwest that had the biggest bank that would have had the most money laying around.
So, Bill, the question is, do you suspect that Cooper chose the Pacific Northwest and perhaps Seafirst Bank intentionally due to the amount of money in the vault?
I can't say that he did or he didn't. I mean, being the largest bank at the time in the Northwest, it would probably make us a target, but,
And how would he have known that the airlines bank with that bank? So he'd have to know that detail also.
Yeah, Northwest Airlines did have a corporate account with Seafirst.
and they had corporate accounts all over the country too, though.
Right.
So it's, there's a lot of who will ever know other than him and how he would remember himself.
Agreed. Well, we're coming up against the time here, so this has been great. I want to thank Tom, obviously. And I want to thank Bill and Peggy Grinnell for coming by. Hopefully they stick around.